Well, good morning, Highlands. If I have not met you, my name is Nathan. I'm one of the new pastors on staff here, and it is a delight to kick off just a mini series called Bold Faith, sharing Jesus in a skeptical age. Now, if you are not a Christian, if you are asking questions about Jesus, but you would still say you're not a follower of Jesus, you might be wondering, why are we doing a series on sharing our faith? Maybe you're thinking, oh man, I came on the wrong Sunday. Well, one of the reasons why we're looking at this theme of sharing our faith with others is because, at least in recent memory, if Christians, if we were going to be honest, we haven't done a great job with this. Philip Yancey, in his book Vanishing Grace, picks up on this idea. He cites 4 common complaints often mentioned about Christians. And number 1 is, this is what people say, unfortunately, this is what people say about Christians. This is how people view Christians. 1, you don't listen to me. 2, you judge me. 3, your faith confuses me. And 4, you talk about what's wrong instead of making it right. And now you just think about that. By the way, it's going to get better from here on out. If you're thinking, man, this is not starting out great here. Where are we going? It's going to hopefully go up from here. But it's a place, hopefully, for us to just, as Christians, as believers, concede the issue that actually there's some truth to this, that people have not seen great things when they take a look inside. And so part of why, so for you, those of us who would consider yourself not a Christian, part of this morning and next Sunday, why we're looking at this idea of sharing our faith, how we can, as Christians, share our faith meaningfully with others. One of the reasons why we're looking at that is because of these reasons, of how do we actually more meaningfully engage with people and reflect the character of Jesus. Hopefully, if you are not a Christian, this series will encourage you to know that we're trying to get better at this. Now, for those of us who would say, no, well, I am actually a believer, I'm a Christian, the hope in these 2 messages is that we will be able to recover confidence. Hopefully, you and I will be able to recover some confidence in the good news of Jesus. You know, years ago, I remember speaking with, in another part of the world with another colleague, and I remember a bunch of people coming to my colleague at the time and saying, look, we need new answers. You know, there's so many different questions coming to us as Christians. We need new answers. And I remember him saying, look, we will get to the answers. There are a lot of answers that can be offered to the different questions that come at us as Christians. But what we really need is not new answers. What we need is fresh confidence. For some of us, we've lost confidence in the fact that there's good news to offer to different aspects of our life, even the complex areas of our life. Jesus is good news there, but actually, here's the thing. If we don't actually believe the thing is good news, then we're not going to be sharing about it, that's for sure. If we've lost the confidence in that. So part of this, hopefully the hope in this message and next week is hopefully by looking at the scriptures, by next week we're going to be looking more closely at Jesus, how he navigated conversations, Paul, how he navigated conversations of faith, and hopefully both this week and next week will provide a means by which we can gather greater, deeper confidence in that this is really, really good news. Now this morning, what I want to do is I want to focus on the passage that we just had read for us from 1 Peter 3, verses 13 to 16. I'm going to zoom in on verse 15. But before we get there, and that's on page 1077 if you're looking for that Bible in front of you. But before we get there, today, just to give you a roadmap, we're going to look at that passage and look at how the scriptures instruct us when we're thinking of how should we be sharing our faith with others. Next week is a more practical sermon on the how. You know, for those of us who would throw our hands up and say, you know, I'm slightly conversationally challenged. I could use some help in actually how do I engage meaningfully in a conversation of faith. Next week, by looking at Jesus and also Paul, we're going to look at how we can practically engage in those conversations. Now this morning, as we get going, I want to begin with a story. a story that I mentioned actually I told the story at the men's conference back in the fall, and I want to share it this morning because it provides a meaningful backdrop for where we're going. Years ago, I was speaking, when I lived in England, I was studying there. I was coming home for Christmas, and the flight plan was from London Heathrow via New York JFK and then on to Toronto International. Toronto was home for me at the time. And now, for those of you who have ever traveled at Christmas, like done air travel at Christmas, you know that you never want to do that again. You feel like at the end of it, you should be getting some kind of trophy. Someone should be giving you some water and a towel because you have just done something that is not great for yourself. So that was me. And I remember getting to the airport. It was busy, it's hectic as it would be at Christmas time, London Heathrow Airport. And when I finally got to the gate, I remember one of the flight attendants saying to me, "Sir, just so you know, the flight is sold out, it's packed," which you don't necessarily want to hear because you know now you're going into, and it's going to be even more frenetic and busy and noisy than you had hoped for. Anyway, I get on this airplane. I'm sitting at the back of the airplane, and it's a cross-Atlantic flight, so a bigger airplane. It's 3 seats and 6 seats and 3 seats. And I'm sitting in the back middle section of this airplane. And so I put my luggage into the overhead compartment, and I sit down. And I don't know if you've ever done air travel and you have this hope of maybe I could just somehow find some small place of zen, of quiet on this busy airplane. So I had unrealistic hopes of somehow obtaining that. But anyway, in the hopes of that, I get my headphones, or I got my earplugs and a book and sitting down. And it's just when I sat down, when I hear this voice. It was a passenger who had just got on the airplane. And I don't know if you've ever encountered someone like this, maybe you know someone like this, or maybe you are this person who when you talk to them, they don't have an understanding or concept of indoor voice. And this was that person. He was talking, and I'm sure he was kind, but he was just, it was one level, and the level was high. And I have to tell you, under my breath, I prayed a prayer in that moment saying, "God, please let that person not be sitting next to me on this airplane." And I want you to take a guess at who you think sat next to me on the airplane for that very long flight. It was this guy. And so he gets closer to my row. He puts his luggage in the overhead compartment, sits down next to me, and immediately nudges my shoulder and engages me in conversation. And he asked me questions, just, I think friendly questions of, "Hey, is this your first departure, or are you leaving from did you come from another city? And what's your final destination? Is it New York, or where are you going from there? And what are you doing for Christmas? Oh, you're spending it with family. What's your family like? What do your mom and dad do? Oh, you have sisters. Okay, what do your sisters?" And I thought, whoa, this is, it was slightly becoming overwhelming and scary too. So I'm engaging with this guy, and the thing is, you're on an airplane, right? So you're stuck. I mean, the best you can do is go to the restroom, but you're coming back, and you don't want to necessarily stay in a airplane restroom on a cross-Atlantic flight. So there's nowhere to go. And he's asking me all these questions, and then it came to an awkward pause, a stop, when he asked me what I was doing. Because when he asked me what I was doing, at the time I was studying philosophy and theology, and told him I was at a Christian college there, and he said, "Hold on, do you believe all that stuff in the Bible?" And I said, "Well, yes, I do." And I was just about to answer, and he cut me off. He said, "Hold on, but you don't really believe all this stuff about like God and like him creating everything. I mean, do you?" And I said, "Well, yes." And I was about to explain, and he cut me off again. He said, "Well, no, but do you believe all the stuff about Jonah? This guy Jonah being swallowed by a whale? You don't believe that, like, do you?" And I said, "Well, yes." And I was just about to explain again. He cut me off, and he just kept going onto Noah and all these issues, and the answer was the same, except he just cut me off. And I looked on my right and looked on my left, slightly frustrated because I wasn't able to actually say anything, at least to this point in the conversation. And as I looked to my right and looked to my left, I saw other passengers leaning in, wondering if there'd ever be a moment where this could develop into a conversation. And we had not left the runway yet. And he didn't have any alcohol in his body, to my knowledge. And I thought, this could be very, very interesting flight. Now, I begin with the story. That's not the full story. I might pick up on this story next week. But I begin with the story because he was asking me these questions, especially the latter questions. He was looking for an answer, but not just any kind of answer. He was wanting me to explain why I believe what I believe. And not always, thankfully, most of our conversations of faith are not, say, as high octane as that. But often in conversations of faith, people are really looking for, why? Can you explain to me why you believe what you believe? And that is really the meaning, it's the thrust behind that word apologetic, to give an apologetic or Christian apologetics. Now, for some of you, when you hear the word apologetic or Christian apologetics, it does not excite you. It's almost like, oh no, not this. And here's where we need to look at what that word means, because actually in the passage we just had read for us, Peter actually cites the word. It's one of the few times in the New Testament where the word apologetic is actually mentioned. So what does the word apologetic mean? Well, first of all, we have to sort of get some confusing ideas out of the way because for some of us, we confuse the idea with just academic, intellectual. So it's sort of like, if you're a really intellectual Christian or really smart Christian, you have answers. That's apologetics. And actually, that's not actually what apologetics means. And unfortunately, for some of us, we have seen people who sort of are interested in Christian apologetics. They have answers to questions, but they're also rude. So it's like, yeah, no thanks. Like, yeah, that's good that you're bright, but you're also rude. And I actually don't want to be around someone like that. And so Christian apologetics is slowly, as we think about it, it doesn't have a good reputation. Peter, just coming back to Peter for a moment, verse 15 of this passage says, but in your hearts, regard Christ the Lord as holy, ready at any time to give a defense. That's that word in the Greek, apologia, which means apologetic in English. Really what apologetics means is reasoned defense. It's explaining why you believe what you believe. Now let me just slow down for a moment. Think about that for a moment. Why do you believe what you believe? It's helpful for us to just think about that introspectively for a moment, because often, as I've thought about it, often when people have asked me why I believe what I believe, I often tell them how. Well, I was at this event in, XYZ. Or I tell them the what, but actually if I think, why do I believe? Okay, that's how, that's what, but why do I believe what I believe? And that's an important question for us to just sit on for a while. And throughout this sermon, we're going to be sort of coming in and out of that question. Why do we believe what we believe? That is the heart of apologetics. It's not actually being smart, but also being obnoxious. No, that's just being obnoxious. That's not apologetics. I remember years ago when I was studying apologetics, I remember coming home for Christmas and wanting to visit with a friend of mine who was on staff at a church. And I was meeting with him for lunch, and he was just running a few minutes late, so I sat in the church lobby, and while I was sitting there, the senior pastor of this church came to me, and by the way, it's not this church, in case you're like, oh, what church is actually in another city? But my friend was a few minutes late. The senior pastor comes out to the lobby area, and he says, oh, are you Nathan? And I said, yes. And so are you studying apologetics right now, Christian apologetics? And I said, yes, yeah, I am. He looked at me and said, I don't like apologetics. I am about relationships. And what's interesting is I know this is going to sound maybe too slick, and it's not meant to sound this, but he eventually gave me an apologetic for why he doesn't like apologetics. But do you see what's happening? He saw apologetics as almost like antithetical. It's like contradictory to actually just being kind, being relationally sensitive. And that's not actually at all, especially as we look at this passage, to explain your faith, to share your faith. The hope is that actually you'd also be relationally, for us, reflect Christ in how we see people. You see, here's the thing, as one person once put it, everyone has an apologetic. In other words, everyone has a reason as to why they believe what they believe. The issue is not whether we have an apologetic. The question is your apologetic a good one? Everyone has one. And I can tell you, I can throw my hands up and say, look, I have had so many clunkers when it comes to conversation of faith. I have bungled it many times. I remember years ago when I was working in the public sector, at the end of it, I was new to this particular job, and we would be working, 12 to 14-hour shifts. And when we had a stretch of these shifts, I didn't know, but this group of guys in my department, they would all go to a strip club. And that was how they celebrated a very long stretch of long day work. And I remember the first time this happened, they said, hey, Nathan, are you going to come with us? And I said, no, I'm just going to go home and I'll be back at work tomorrow. And another guy who was not going, the only other guy in the department who wasn't going, he said, hey, if you'd like, I can just give you a ride home in my car. You don't have to take the subway. We can go, you can come with me. I can drop you off at your apartment. So I took him up on that offer. And we were driving to my apartment, and before we got to my home there, he said, look, I have a job in the morning that I'm going to. That's why I'm not going out with the guys tonight. But why aren't you going out with the guys? That's a space right there. That's the apologetic moment. That's a sharing your faith moment. And I remember in that moment saying to him, well, I'm just not into that kind of thing. I gave an apologetic, but it wasn't a very good one. I wasn't able to, in that moment, express my conviction. So in a way, I copped out and said, well, I'm just not into that kind of stuff, which is not actually true to my Christian conviction. Everyone has an apologetic for their faith. The question is yours, is mine a good one? So the roadmap for this morning, we're going to look at this passage, and I'm going to really do a close-up look of verse 15. Look at how Peter explains sharing your faith. What does sharing your faith look like? He's speaking into his context. It's thousands of years now. But from there, looking at that context, what Peter says to that group of people, looking at that, and then looking at actually how that instructs us today and how that instructs when we engage in conversation of faith. And then from there, then looking hopefully at what do we take from here? When we leave this morning, what are we going to take home with us? Let me pray, and then we'll get into the scriptures. Father, please speak to us. We need to hear your voice. We need your help. Come now. Help us to hear your voice through the scriptures. Change us, mold us for your sake. In your name, amen. So we begin with the context. And the context, well, let's look at the passage, 1 Peter 3:15. But in your hearts, regard Christ the Lord as holy, ready at any time to give a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Now, in order to understand the deeper meaning of this passage, we need to look at, at least some of the context. There's a lot going on here. But first of all, who's writing? Well, we know it's sort of obvious, but it's Peter. Peter, this disciple, this follower, this close follower of Jesus. Now remember, Peter was one who did both. He got it profoundly right at times, and he got it dreadfully wrong at other times. He was the one, if you remember the story in Caesarea Philippi, when Jesus is looking to his friends and says, who do people say the Son of Man is? And they have these different, very theologically rich answers. And then Jesus actually comes right at them and says, but who do you say I am? And Peter's the one. Peter's the guy who actually says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he has other moments that are great. He also has some really bad moments. Do you remember this moment where Jesus is telling them they're getting closer and closer and closer to the cross, and Jesus explains how this is the way of the Messiah. The Messiah must suffer. The Messiah must die. And Peter, just wanting to be a good friend to Jesus, takes him aside and he says, Jesus, now I'm paraphrasing here, but Jesus, no, you're not going to do that. You're Messiah, and Messiahs don't die. That's the thing. Messiahs don't suffer Jesus. So you need to stop talking about suffering. You need this cross talk. You need to stop talking about that. So he actually rebukes Jesus. And Jesus in turn rebukes Peter. And he actually looks to Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, as a general rule of thumb, you never want to be called Satan by God. And that's what happens to Peter here. So he has great moments and he also has really bad moments. But we know that amidst all of that, he eventually, he became a bastion of the early church. This is the man who's writing to a group of Christians in what we would now consider Turkey, early 60s AD, approximately 30 or so years after Jesus. Now, the key detail here to remember is that Peter is writing to a group of Christians who are living in a hostile world. Well, let's just stop there for a moment, because those are two important details. He's writing to Christians. Now, that's important because often we think of sharing our faith. If you're anything like me, you might say, well, I don't have that gift. I'm not good at evangelism, so that's why I don't do that, because, well, other people, this person over here, they're gifted. They have the gift of evangelism. Peter's not writing to a group of specialists here. So that should challenge us a bit. He's not writing to these like elite or professional Christians. He's writing to just ordinary Christians and challenging them. He's also encouraging them, maybe reminding them to be ready to share their faith. But more than writing to Christians, he's writing to Christians who are living in a hostile world. Many in this context, the people to whom Peter's writing have endured physical persecution and suffering. So the thought of losing their life for the sake of Christ is a real thought for them. This is part of why, going back verse 14, he says, "Do not fear them or be intimidated." He is telling them to not be afraid because he knows many of them are feeling afraid. Why? Why is he telling them to not be afraid? Peter is telling them to not be afraid because he knows that pain, hardship, suffering, it has a way of sowing fear into the bloodstream. So Peter's acknowledging that. He is acknowledging the pain they've experienced. And it's almost as though he's pleading with them and he's saying, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't fear. So Peter's writing to Christians, not a group of specialists. He's writing to Christians who have experienced physical persecution. And if they were to share their faith, they know that they are risking their lives for it. Now, if we were to look at this passage 10 years ago, or even 20 years ago, there would probably be some type of disconnect because we wouldn't know. We'd have to really work our imaginations to think of like, what would that be like? Physical persecution, hostile world. But increasingly, at least here in the Western Hemisphere, in the last, at least 5 years, if not more, there's been a growing sense of hostility against Jesus, the way of Jesus. And it wasn't too long ago where Christians were viewed as foolish, silly, sort of out of date, outlandish. But now Christians more and more are seen, when you look at the different cultural questions that are happening, Christians are seen as dangerous, oppressive. It's not actually like foolish anymore. It's actually moved from being foolish to actually dangerous to hold to belief in Jesus. So what's interesting is then we move along here to see, okay, given that's the context, Peter's acknowledging this. He's aware of the context in which he's writing, people who could actually lose their lives if they share their faith. What's Peter going to say then? How will he counsel them? How will he counsel this group of people who are worn down or afraid? Here's a question. How would you counsel them? If you were on the phone, if someone gave you a call or sent you an email and said, look, we're in a lot of trouble here. We're worried for our lives. We're not sure if we're going to make it because people don't like us because of our faith. Our lives feel threatened. How would you counsel someone like that? Think of a friend, maybe a missionary that you support. What would you say to that person? Now, obviously, these issues are complicated and complex. I can tell you, as I thought about that, I might think of who's a group of people I can get around this situation right now, and think of how we can get money to this family or to this missionary to help get them out of that situation. Get them back home. Get them out of that situation. So what's Peter going to say? Peter actually doesn't do that at all. He's not thinking, hey, well, let's get you out of that situation. He's actually saying, no, here's how you have courage in this situation. His instructions are to be ready. Be ready to give an answer when the conversations happen. Peter is very clear on his emphasis about having an apologetic, having an answer for why you believe what you believe. But what's interesting about that is the order in which he says things, because he actually doesn't start with sharing your faith. It doesn't start with giving an answer. It's actually, he starts with, in your hearts, regard Christ the Lord as holy. So the focus for Peter isn't actually, okay, so now you need to think about what you're going to say. No, before actually what we're going to say, it actually comes back to what's happening in our hearts. In your hearts, regard Christ the Lord as holy. So before it's about an answer, it's actually about what is happening in our hearts, in your hearts. The question is, what does that word mean? What does the word heart actually mean? Because in our culture, heart is often associated with emotions, how you feel. Hey, what's happening in your heart right now? That's often thought of feelings as a seat of the emotions. But in the New Testament, heart is associated with the core of our being. It's the center of one's spiritual life. It's the control center, so to speak. This is where temptation happens. This is where struggle, doubt happens. It's also where devotion takes place, where faith and trust in Jesus takes place. Peter is saying that, yeah, we need to tell people about Jesus. We must do that. But before we give a response, we need to ask ourselves whether God himself has touched the very core of our lives. That's the starting point. One theologian named Rowan Williams said, Christianity is a contact before it's a message. It's actually, have you met this person, Jesus, and then it's actually telling people about it. Years ago, I remember speaking at a university in Oklahoma, and I was with a few of my colleagues at the time there, and we were at a series of events, and one evening we had dinner with the chaplain of the university. And this guy had been there, I think, for just over 30 years, the chaplain of the university. And that evening, he told us sort of his story, his testimony, and he said, one thing I'll never forget is he said, he had been at the university for 18 years, and up to that 18-year point, he had officiated baptism services, weddings, funerals, had given hundreds upon hundreds of sermons, but it was only in year 18 at the college when he actually committed his life to Jesus. I remember just thinking, I couldn't make sense of that. Now just think about that for a moment. He was the guy doing the business. He was giving these sermons. He was counseling students. He had a degree. He was ordained by a Christian denomination here in America. Officiated weddings, funerals, baptism services, and yet he had never committed his life to Jesus. And that's part of what Peter is challenging here. He's saying, look, the thing really actually isn't what you say in the conversation. That's important. But the first thing is you've got to know Jesus. If you haven't met him, if you haven't given your life to him, then the whole thing else doesn't really matter. You've got to know Jesus. Is he Lord? Has he been, in Peter's language, has he been set apart as Lord in your life? Regard Christ the Lord as holy in your hearts. Peter's saying, look, tell people we must, but we've got to attend to our hearts first. And whatever we say comes from that. He then says, ready at any time to give a defense. Ready at any time to give a defense. Now, baked into this idea of him saying ready at any time to give a defense is the idea that it's not a matter of if, but when you'll be asked a question about your faith. Peter is saying, look, if you are living a life that reflects Jesus, his character, you will be asked questions. And if I were to, as I put Peter's words into a question, this is the question I think Peter would ask us today. Are we living a life that causes people to say, that's amazing? Why? These are some hard questions we need to ask ourselves. Do people look at our lives and say, wow, that's amazing. Tell me why. Tell me why do you believe that? And that might even, if we look at it, that could be friends, it could be close family, it could be our kids. You say, oh, that's interesting. Why do we do that? Sharing our faith happens at that level. But first it starts with seeing something. Peter's saying, look, they have to see something. You know, this one evangelist named Gypsy Smith once said there are 5 gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the Christian. Most people will never read the first 4. The idea there is, what does our life look like? Because the first point of entry for most people will be actually the Christian, what our lives look like. This is why Blaise Pascal, the French mathematician, once put it like this: make it attractive. Make good men wish it were true, then show that it is. Make it attractive. Make good men wish it were true, then show that it is. And I can tell you, often when I've been in conversation of faith, I don't think about the first part. I think about, okay, what am I going to say? But Pascal, and beyond that, what Peter's saying is actually, it starts with, what do our lives look like? And if our lives reflect Jesus, we will be asked questions. Ready at any time, Peter writes, to give a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Always ready. This is the apologetic part. This is where the word actually is. So what is apologetics? What should sharing our faith look like? I remember one of my professors in graduate school putting it like this: sharing our faith should be like sweeping away debris that covers the truth so that people can have an unobstructed view of Jesus. Somehow in our conversations, somehow also in the way in which we embody Christ, hopefully we are sweeping away the debris, not providing more debris, but actually sweeping away debris that covers the truth so that people can have an unobstructed view of Jesus, the beauty and attractiveness of Jesus. That's what sharing our faith should be. Now, this can happen through statements, but I want to suggest also this can happen often more meaningfully through questions. And we're going to look at that next week, look at how Jesus and Paul both do this masterfully in conversations. It's not necessarily the statements that are probing, it's actually the questions. We're going to look at that next week. Peter here writes of giving an answer, and this answer is linked to hope. Give a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. So what is hope? What is hope for you? If we think about that word hope, it's actually become very soft in our contemporary speak. It's, hey, I hope you'll make it out okay. I hope you're having a good day. and it's become a somewhat weak term, but hope for Peter is an incredibly rich word. It's linked fundamentally to the resurrection of Jesus. Is speaking to our life that actually no matter how bleak our lives might be at times, the resurrection of Jesus says the end is marked by his redemptive power. But more than that, the hope that Peter's referring to is marked by his presence, the presence of Jesus living in our lives. This is why Paul elsewhere in Colossians speaks of Christ in you, the hope of glory. This is where hope lies for Peter. This is what's informing his imagination and where hope comes from. Hope comes from the resurrection of Jesus. Hope is also in that fact, this resurrection power means that Jesus lives inside our lives. And here's the thing. If Jesus is not in our lives, if he is not Lord of our lives, then we can't offer that to other people. Because a general principle is you cannot give what you do not have. We cannot give others what we don't have. If we don't have Jesus as Lord over our lives, then we can't offer that to others. And just touching on the first part of verse 16, he doesn't close just with the hope. He actually also says, but also in all of this, make sure that you're doing it with gentleness and reverence. A translation, when you speak on behalf of Christ, ensure it looks and sounds like Christ. You know, I remember a friend of mine years ago saying, Christians have turned rudeness into a spiritual gift. And I was like, sometimes they can say something that's like, yeah, I think I agree with that, but they're so rude that the whole thing is just thrown out because of that rudeness. But they've almost seen as like, it's right to be rude as long as you have the right answer. And Peter's saying, no, you have to do this with gentleness and reverence. How we communicate this message, how we share faith has to be matched with the beauty of the message. This, for Peter, this is what apologetics is. This is what sharing our faith should look like. The beauty and attractiveness of Christ in thought, in word, in deed. So where do we go from here? I want to just close with a few practical points. First is start with Jesus. So when we think of sharing our faith, I'll just own this. I often think of, okay, what am I going to say? How am I going to navigate this conversation? And Peter actually dials it back. He says, actually, we don't start there. We don't actually start with what we're going to say, what we're going to read. No, we actually start with Jesus. In your hearts, regard Christ the Lord as holy. It starts there. Evangelism, sharing our faith, also means we start where we are. Often the tendency is, when we hear about sharing our faith or think of all the conversations that we've had and we think, oh man, I could have said this, oh, I want to do over there, and oh, at work this week, I know this guy's going to ask me this question, or this girl is, and we have all these questions of situations and we think, oh, what am I going to say? The challenge from Peter here is just start where you are. It could be with a neighborhood friend. It could be with a family member. It could be with a colleague that you'll see at that coffee bar this week, the water cooler. Start where you are. That also means in how we study. When Peter uses the word always ready, other translations have be prepared. And that word has with the idea of getting fit. So part of the discipline here is that actually, will we study? Will we actually be ready? Will we study, read? Will we ask the questions? So part of this also does mean actually studying and being ready for a conversation of faith. Start with Jesus. Start where you are and remember that this is a spiritual discipline. This is actually not fundamentally intellectual. In other words, the quality of how we engage in conversation of faith is not dependent upon our intellectual prowess. It's not about, okay, who's the smartest person in the room here? No, that's actually, Peter's saying, no, that's not it, actually. That's not how evangelism, that's not the way of Jesus. It's fundamentally saying, God, I need your help here. Lead me, guide me, help me to know what to say here. Now, it's also using what we have. So if we haven't done any study or even thinking towards this, then it's a challenge. But actually, if we've studied and been thoughtful and constructive about how we could meaningfully engage here, then we commit all that to Jesus and ask him for help in this. Hopefully that provides some encouragement as we leave today. As we close, I wanted to ask a question, and it comes back to one of the questions that Peter asked. He states, rather, that all of this is linked to hope. Where is your hope today? Where is our hope today? One theologian puts it like this: hope for the Christian is anticipated joy. Because of the resurrection, hope is anticipated joy. And part of that is in the now and also not yet. My prayer for you this morning is that we would leave this morning with a sense of renewed hope. That actually, no matter where we find ourselves, the end is joy because of Jesus. That is what he offers us today. That is what he offers us and through us to the people we will be sharing our faith with. Let's pray. Father, I pray that you would help us. I pray that for each person here, you would encourage their hearts with your love, with your truth, with your goodness, with your beauty. Help us to become more aware, Lord, of those things, of your truth. Touch our hearts and minds today by the power of your Spirit, by your word. And as we leave here today, fill us afresh with courage and confidence for your sake, Jesus. Amen.